Welcome to Flexing the Future, the Entras podcast on the energy transition and flexibility. By us, Frank Allaerts,
Jens Batens,
and Jan Van Roost. In this podcast, we'll discuss the impact of the energy transition on the flexibility of the industry in Belgium and in Europe.
Not among ourselves, of course. Alternatively, we'll ask true experts in the field to share their knowledge, insights and vision with you.
Welcome to Flexing the Future, the Entras podcast about energy transition and the role of flexibility in this process. Today we have Jan Van Roost in our studio. Welcome, Jan. Jan, I want to jump into the podcast with an immediate question. What is your personal view on the current state of affairs of the energy transition? Where are we going? Is the energy transition on its way, or what do you think?
Well, Frank, first of all, thank you very much for having us. It's a real pleasure to be here. Taking a broader perspective on things, we have seen the energy and power market evolve, first with a few packages of liberalization. Then we saw the transition from centralized to decentralized and renewable energies. And now I believe that there is a strong reinforcement with also a shift from gas to power, which also will impact the electricity system. And from my perspective, in hindsight, it's often easy to reconstruct what we've seen, but I do think that we may miss a global master plan of where we're heading.
Okay, that's a clear answer. Thank you, Jan. May I ask you to introduce yourself and your company?
Sure. So my name is Jan Van Roost. I've been serving Coreso since a couple of years. I'm a CEO. Coreso is a technical electricity coordination center, and we are located in Brussels. Our shareholders and owners are the grid operators in Europe. And so we provide 24/7 electricity coordination services to the energy market, to the transmission system operators, and to society as a whole.
All right, that's a whole task. But then Coreso, is that a bit like an area for Europe, or is it something else?
It's indeed close to what you're saying. Coreso is what we call a regional coordination center. We coordinate the grid security and the market capacities at a pan-European level, and we complement the national views of the transmission system operator with a pan-European or regional European view. So a regional security analysis or a regional capacity calculation.
And is that the same? If you say Europe, you mean the European Union or different countries?
Principally continental Europe,
but
it's all the countries in the European Union that get served by regional coordination centers.
Okay. So, for instance, the UK then not? Or?
Well, UK was historically and is still one of our shareholders, and even after Brexit, they decided to remain on board and continue to use our coordination services.
All right, that's an important one, I guess. But then, so if you coordinate, a very general statement that you often hear is there is a lot of wind in Northern Europe and a lot of sun in Southern Europe. So you could then say when there's wind, the energy goes to the south and the other way around. It might be a somewhat simple representation of what happens, but what consequences have those? What consequences does this have on the grid?
Well, the example you give is a typical example. In general, what we do is we will check if the electricity can safely be transported from the generation source to the consumers throughout Europe. And if we detect constraints in national grids or in neighboring grids, we will work together with those transmission system operators to alleviate and find a solution. If we see that there is a constraint, we will escalate it and find a compromise solution. And this can be done through suggesting redispatchings of power plants. It can also result in suggesting different grid topologies, which are typically the measures at hand. Now, of course, weather forecast has increased in importance over the last decades, and it's something that we and the transmission grid operators include in our daily planning activities. And it's also something you see coming. To give you an example, one of the jobs we do is adequacy analysis. And so we have a rolling forecast where for the next 7 days we will always check, are we able to deliver the power requested by the power supplied, or is there a risk of having grid constraints or not?
All right. And those constraints, just to have an idea of what those could be, could you give a few examples of what were constraints that happened the past years?
Well, the electricity grid in Europe is, of course, not a copper plate. In the minds of some, it is, but the history behind the grids, the national evolutions, also determines where the constraints are. And typically, I see two large blocks when I look at Europe. When you look at Benelux, France, the Iberian Peninsula towards Italy, the regions that we mostly serve, you can almost accept any combination of generation and load without having to resort to costly redispatching measures. We can just, use phase shifters or topological measures in the grid to allow any combination. When we look at the German side of the story, there are more constraints in the grid because of historical evolutions, and so they have to resort to costly redispatching measures, even in a preventive way, in order to give sufficient capacity to the markets to do the trading.
Okay. And maybe an engineering question. If you talk about phase shifters, how can I see this? Is that really then Coreso that some way controls those phase shifters, or are there intermediate parties?
No, so the phase shifters are owned and operated by the national grid operators. Coreso has a view on where the phase shifters are located. We also know what the options and the effects of such a device are. And we can, of course, suggest it would be good to take some steps or some taps on those phase shifters, and also to coordinate amongst them each other to avoid contractivity.
All right. So, but then I conclude that Coreso sometimes sees things that the grid operators didn't see.
It is possible because we have a broader view on things. Typically, a national grid operator looks at its own country with the first few neighboring grid stations, whereas we always look at a region in Europe, be it the continental part of Europe, be it the Iberian Peninsula, and so we will see much broader and further.
Okay, so there's lots of data that are coming to Coreso then.
Correct. In fact, when we were set up back in 2009, it was a voluntary initiative that was launched by Elia of Belgium and RTE of France to avoid some of the blackouts we had in the early 2000s, be in Italy or be it in continental Europe. And back at that moment in time, there was no regulation, but we thought it was good to actually look at a broader view. And what you see nowadays is that the activities we started back then are now at the basis of the regulation that is being forced upon us.
Yeah, okay. Those data, I can imagine they're very critical. So I guess this is, in terms of cybersecurity, your organization is probably well operated.
Well, cybersecurity, I think it's a hot topic. It is also an important point of attention for us and our board members. And without going into detail, in the early days, you just start your thing in an Excel file, but we have evolved to also introducing the necessary processes, standardization, rigor, and controls amongst ourselves, with our transmission system operators, but also with our industry association, NSOE.
Yeah, all right. So you just mentioned that in the early days that there were some blackouts, and that Coreso then, let's say, is established to prevent them. How is this situation now? Suppose there would be some situation where a blackout could arise. What happens then?
Well, the mission of Coreso is to help avoid society a blackout in Europe as such. And we do that by rigorously checking and cross-checking all the grid security phases and capacity planning phases from the early time horizons on. We start a year ahead with consistency checks on outage and maintenance planning, and we also start in the year ahead by giving part of the market capacities. And these processes repeat themselves on shorter time frames, and then the idea is to do that in a rigorous way to never end up in a situation that would lead to a blackout. And there are two potential, let's say, situations that could lead to a blackout. First, outages or cascading of outages that lead to network splits. And that's where our grid security calculations should prevent us from doing that. On the other hand, there is also the adequacy question, which means being able to supply the load of your customers at any given point in time. And there we also have processes that start with a long-term outlook, winter outlook, summer outlook, and that culminate in a rolling 7-day process where we will check, is there sufficient supply on the market? And if you have both of them well managed and controlled, you should really reduce your risk of blackout to a minimum.
Yeah. All right. So I understand then that with these horizons of 7 days, you have a kind of a common sense check. Could there be a problem? But of course, the electricity grid has to be in balance at every second, so to speak. So suppose something unexpectedly and big happens, which creates a very big imbalance, sudden, not expected, of course. Is there then also a role for Coreso?
So Coreso's role runs from the planning phase until close to real time, couple of hours before real-time operations. Real-time operations is truly in the hands of the national security authorities and the national grid operators. If ever you were to be in a situation, we would come in the background to help check the status of the grid and also provide advice and options. But the real-time role is in the hands of the national transmission system operators.
All right. And so if it would happen, a blackout, the national institutions have to solve it, but then you would still be there for, let's say, for the same 7 days horizon. What could be done the next hours or days?
Correct.
All right. Very interesting. Then a question of today, in the light of the energy transition, which is moving forward fast. From your perspective, what do you think are the main challenges here?
Well, the energy transition that we see nowadays, it puts extra stress and strain on the grids, technical and infrastructure-wise, and also on some of the market mechanisms. And if we look at the grids themselves, we come from market liberalization, where in the late 90s and early 2000s, through several liberalization packages, centralized production was given to the market, and also centralized grid planning was given more to a regulatory body and a transmission system operator. We saw that in the early days we could actually use the slack of the system to our benefit. And then we saw the shift from centralized production to decentralized production. But that also means if all of a sudden your power is generated somewhere else than where it used to be, but still consumed locally, that the use of your grid needs to change, and you need to start investing in physical assets. We, as transmission system operator and regional coordination centers, we also help to maximize the use of the existing assets by doing intelligent planning, by using flexible and dynamic line rating, for example. And now we see that in the energy transition there is also a shift from gas to power, which will mean that there will be an ever further increasing electricity demand on the grid. And so it will further stress and strain the physical infrastructure. It will put more pressure to also have market mechanisms to use the same physical infrastructure more intensely. And a question that is not so much in our hand is, I think Elia has done some very good rigorous studies where they forecast increases of load by 2035 with approximately 50% or even more. But I wonder where that energy is going to come from. That's another question we need to solve. And so if you put all of that together, the need to be able to invest in the physical assets, to source the material and to deliver on time. It's a big challenge there. But also all of the market mechanisms to exchange between countries, where you see that regulators and the European Commission has ambition. Sometimes the time frames of doing an IT project are not the ones of the ambitions that are in mind of some of the market players.
I conclude that it's a really huge challenge because a rise in 50%.
It's huge.
It's never been done before, I guess.
No, what you saw up until, let's say, the financial crisis of 2008 was that the electricity consumption just increased with the GDP on a yearly basis. And then it stabilized somewhat. It had to do with the financial industrial crisis back then. And we also saw that renewable energy started to appear at low voltage levels, therefore reducing the load. Yeah. And we also saw more attention on energy effectiveness. So the electricity load did not increase such significantly anymore. In the last 2 years, after what is happening between Russia and Ukraine, we saw even significant decreases in energy consumption. And so now it may pick up significantly again.
Yeah, and it's looking like that then geopolitical events are kind of a driver for things, apparently.
The interesting thing, coming back to the geopolitical events, is we, in the electricity business, we saw that it was not always easy to get the right price incentives to all of the market consumers. Big industrial players, they had the means and the size to use the price incentives to their advantage. But it did not really trickle down all the way to small and medium enterprises and residential customers. What we did see in the last 2 years is that the geopolitical issues have actually given price incentives that are so large that everybody started to worry about this. And we saw significant decreases in load. There's, of course, a duality about this. On the one hand, it might have sensibilized certain parties, but on the other hand, it could also lead to deindustrialization here in Europe.
What do you think the importance of flexibility is in this story?
Well, like we said before, if there is such a huge increase or additional load forecasted because of the Green Deal and because of shifting gas to power, you may not have either the grids or the generation at the right moment in time. And then you have to play with market incentives, price incentives, and flexibility to shift, the consumption and the generation to be more in line with each other. It can sound rather abstract, but we see this from a global aggregated level on the grid. And so every little contribution can help, but we need to set the right incentives to all parties.
Yeah, but is it like flexibility is a pillar that will support the European grid in the coming years? Or is it more nice to have because it helps?
Well, I think it will help us make part of the transition, and then it will be there to stay once you have the right price incentives at every level. Because we cannot just say, well, the load will suddenly increase with 50%, but the generation or the grids cannot follow yet. There's going to be huge pressure to find a way forward, and this flexibility can be part of the transition.
Yeah, and all right, and if flexibility would be the answer, then the conclusion is the price signals will in that case be so high that it will come, and that parties will get motivated to realize it in some way or another.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. Maybe a question then about the European grid, because of course the grid is, we have always known a grid and it's growing. And in your view, what is the current state of the European grid then?
Well, I think the challenges in the European grid are similar. The European grid is a constitution of all national individual grids that have a history and a legacy. And where the challenges in France, for example, might be to further incentivize and integrate renewable energies, we see that our colleagues in Germany, they have some bottlenecks in the north to south transport access. And so, generally speaking, the combination of needing to reinforce transmission capacity on land, or having to interconnect offshore wind parks, or having offshore HVDC cables or offshore grids, it leads to huge investments that we also have to be able to jointly with the industry to deliver, because there might be a risk of sourcing issues where there is much more project and investment ambition than that the market can actually deliver and produce from a physical capacity point of view.
All right. But then specifically regarding the role of Coreso, so I think the cross-border capacity seems to be an issue, because why would, if you take Germany for instance, why would I be motivated to build a lot of connections with other countries?
Okay, so what you see is, we talked about the legacy and the history behind the national grids that then constitutes the European grid, but there is also regulation and legislation coming from Europe and being supervised by ACER, the Association of the European Regulators, that force or oblige nations and grid operators to at least give 70% of their physical grid capacity to cross-border trades, just to avoid exactly what you said, that there is a national interest and a priority given to local needs only. So a lot of the TSOs have been or are still struggling with granting the 70% of their asset infrastructure to the markets. And so we help to optimize the cross-border capacity and try to reach that 70% target by doing the right calculations and by suggesting the right topologies.
All right. And then suppose there is at one point, at a certain border, a big problem, a shortage of capacity. In the long run, I mean. So what will happen then? Coreso will notice that by doing analysis, and it will trickle down to eventually some actor that might be forced in a way to realize this connection capacity, or how do...
It goes a bit into that direction. If we see that there are structural bottlenecks, what you will notice is that there is a risk of having what we call market split. That means that the electricity price is different in a different region in Europe.
Right. Yeah.
And this is also a political issue. For example, you could have a country where there are constraints and bottlenecks that is currently seen as one bidding zone. Part of the solution could be to split up that country in different bidding zones, therefore partially alleviating the constraint. But from a political point of view, it's very difficult to explain to one nation that there are different prices. Now, if we continue to see structural constraints, we can feed the long-term planning process, which is being supervised by NSOE, and the Commission also has a project of common interest, where certain cost-benefit analysis can also lead to extra funding to alleviate and invest in these constraints.
All right. And so what is your personal view on this then? Because I understand that a lot of work needs to be done. We are looking at this 50% increase of electricity consumed. Will we get there in time as Europe?
That's, of course, a big question. I think there is also a question of haves and have-nots. The ambition to shift from gas to power, the Green Deal, it is top of mind for some political players, for individuals that can and have the luxury to spend time on this. But there is also a large part of society that is not thinking about the end of the world, but about the end of the week and the end of the month. And so we have to find a way that everybody steps into that, because not everybody can afford this switch from gas to power. So it's an important aspect that we first need to see materialize. It's not because the ambition is there that everybody is able to follow. And this will also play a role in how fast we will go.
Yeah. So in fact, everybody has some potential to follow or not follow, and that's true for the grid. But your point is, it's in fact you have also to look at industry. Do they do it, and to look at the whole society? In fact,
absolutely.
Right.
And this will determine the speed in which we go towards this additional increase in electricity load.
Yeah. And then when I go back to Belgium, there have been a lot of discussions the past years, let's say, where people say that investments in the grid are required to prevent the lights from going out. And so there's Elia does a lot of study, but what is the real risk of these lights going out? Is there, for instance, is it really so that it's much worse now than a few years ago? Or you also see a lot of reports from the grid operator that they advise what to do. And so if the advices are followed, I presume then that the lights will not go out. How is your... what do you consider important here, and what do you see as important drivers for the lights not to go out?
But indeed, if we, like you said, focus back on Belgium, there has been a lot of investments to upgrade existing transmission capacity, but you have to consider that Belgium is a relatively small country that is very well interconnected with the neighboring countries.
Yeah.
There are a lot of interconnections with Netherlands, France that have historically been there. They have been reinforced. We have over the past years also interconnected with Germany, which was not the case for a long time. There are HVDC undersea submarine interconnectors with the UK. And so you see that in order to supply its own customers, the grid was quite solid.
Yeah.
On top of that, we saw a huge evolution in market trades with flows coming through Belgium that don't necessarily that are not necessarily related to a commercial deal that is made with Belgium. That's the case throughout Europe.
Yeah.
And so you also need to add that effect on top. So like we said earlier, the shift from centralized industry to a liberalized industry, the shift from centralized generation to renewable generation, the increase in trades and market, these are all additional stresses and strains that are being put on the grid, but for which, if we look at the Belgian case, huge investments have been done. If we look at the investment budgets of, let's say, 15 or 20 years ago, when we compare them to now, there are multiple factors of difference. So I think the necessary steps are being taken. I also believe that in the Belgian case, the grid operator has brought the right arguments forward, working together with the regulators to also secure the necessary investment budgets for that. And the big challenge will now be to deliver on all of this.
Yeah. And then permits come into play and all the other... all right. A question comes to my mind. I don't know whether you can answer it, but I presume that you know whether there are some danger zones in Europe for blackouts. Is this
well,
and where is Belgium then positioned?
there shouldn't be, because
right.
in the whole ecosystem there is a whole policy of operational handbooks and rules and regulations to which you have to abide to exactly avoid that. And there is also the fact that Europe is so well interconnected. There's also a solidarity mechanism to support each other and to exactly avoid blackouts. There are maybe regions where there is, due to historical reasons, a grid that is maybe less meshed or less reinforced. And I think if you look at Belgium from that point of view, we are a very densely meshed grid, having a lot of voltage layers that are well interconnected. So I wouldn't worry too much from the Belgian perspective.
Yeah.
Of course, like we said earlier, the whole grid is interconnected, and we have to avoid cascading effect between each other. And again, that's where Coreso looks pan-European, exactly to avoid that. Yeah,
no, that's indeed what I understand. There's a lot of people with a lot of expertise constantly looking at this, at the grid, in fact, and keeping it safe. And maybe a general question, from your point of view, which trends and developments are important to follow?
Well, what's top of our minds is implementing the liberalization packages that are being put forward by the European Commission. currently we spend about 60% of our development budget on what they call the third energy package, which is the capacity allocation mechanism package and the grid security package. Beyond that, there's already a fourth clean energy package which has been launched by the Commission. But that means
Yes.
the ideas go faster than the implementation because, like I said, 60% on third energy package, and there is already a fourth energy package, and there's already ideas to go beyond that. So making sure we can deliver, it's important. In order to do so, I would also like to plead that all parties involved find a pragmatic, common sense way forward. Because if we need to tailor-make solutions to the last specific detail of every region and every individual, it's going to take a very long time before we're done implementing that. And next to that, we're also looking at some trends that are surrounding us. What is going to happen with offshore grids, HVDC cables? Can we play a role in there? Can we optimize things? Same goes for things like inertia in the electricity grid, for example. When you used to have physical generation assets, mechanically speaking, that was not an issue. But we see a lot of solar farms, we see a lot of windmills connected in a non-mechanical inertia way to the grid anymore. And so at one point you will also reach a tipping point. So those are a little bit of things we are trying to supervise and they're top of mind for us.
All right. So but then on these topics, you do probably a lot of study work and you advise then also the Commission on those topics.
We can give advice through consultation of the Commission.
Okay.
You see that the Commission has a direct line with the regional bodies and with the TSOs, and we are often invited there.
All right.
It's not that we have a direct advisory role to the Commission.
And does all the European governments also play a role in this process?
They play a role by actually translating this into national legislation. So Coreso became formally a regional coordination center in the summer of 2022. And so it had to be endorsed by the national regulator of the country in which we are established. And it made a tour with all of our shareholders. It even had an impact on updating our articles of association. So yes, they do play a role.
Yeah, all right. Okay, I think we're now heading towards the end of our podcast. Is there a final advice or a message that you want to share?
Well, I think it's important that we all step over our shadows going forward and that we try to find compromise and accept to have first pragmatic solutions before having the perfect solution, because perfection is the enemy of progress.
Okay.
And if I look at Coreso itself, we are a growing company, currently about 100 and 140 individuals helping to secure the grid on a daily basis. And we are always looking for enthusiasts, people. Currently, we have some 40 passport holders from all over the world working with us in an English-speaking environment in Brussels. So
yeah. All right. I noticed that your message is very comparable to the messages of other guests in the podcast who are really industrial players. So I guess maybe in the end, everybody has the same challenges.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah. All right.
Well, thank you, Frank.
Thank you very much for this podcast, Jan.
It was my pleasure.